These are the 4 strongest admirals in Roger's era. Back when Roger, Whitebeard, and Rocks were reshaping the seas, the Marines had monsters of their own. We're not just talking about Garp and Sangoku. There were whispers of admirals who were so powerful, the world government erased their legacy. Some rose through the ranks, and some disappeared without a trace. So who were these legends? And why is Oda hiding them from us? Let's break down the 4 strongest admirals from the Pirate King's era, what we know, what Oda hinted, and the Wild Theories fans are piecing together from the shadows. There's a reason why even the most hardened pirates in the One Piece world whisper Garp's name with a mix of fear and respect, because calling him just a vice admiral is like calling Kaido a heavy drinker. Sure, the title's technically true, but it doesn't even come close to telling the full story. Garp was offered the position of admiral multiple times, and not just once or twice. We're talking dozens. Over and over again, the world government practically begged him to take the seat of power. He had the strength, he had the respect, he had the resume of a war god. But Garp refused every single time, and it wasn't because he lacked ambition. It was because he valued something far rarer in the world of One Piece. Freedom. And yeah, that's a huge deal, because in the Navy, refusing a promotion isn't just rare, it's basically unheard of. But Garp didn't care about ranks, he didn't care about titles, and he definitely didn't want to become a puppet for the Celestial Dragons. In his own words, a promotion just means less freedom to do what I like. That one sentence says everything you need to know about Garp. He wasn't anti-authority just for the sake of it, he simply didn't want to waste his life following orders from spoiled gods who had never once stepped onto a battlefield. If he became an admiral, he would have been forced to take commands from the same people he despised. So he stayed where he was. Technically a vice admiral, yes, but only on paper. And the crazy part? The Marines still treated him like an admiral. Garp didn't need the title. He had the authority, the pull, and the respect of an entire generation of soldiers and warriors. If Sangoku was the strategist behind the curtain, Garp was the one who walked onto the battlefield and made the enemy question whether they ever wanted to fight the Marines in the first place. He was untouchable, unmovable. And back in the era of Roger, he wasn't just some supporting act. He was the rival to the Pirate King himself. That's not speculation, that's straight from the lore. Garp and Roger fought side by side and against each other, and the fact that those two respected each other so much tells you exactly what kind of monster Garp was. But there's more to this dynamic than people realize. People love to hype up Luffy and Blackbeard as opposites, freedom versus chaos, inherited will versus stolen fate, but long before that clash was ever set in motion, Garp and Roger were the original dichotomy. One stood on the side of law, the other on the side of freedom. But when you strip away the uniforms and the titles, you realize they weren't so different. Both were men who refused to be caged by the system. Both laughed in the face of kings and challenged the so-called gods. And both believed in forging their own path even if the whole world stood against them. That's probably why Roger trusted Garp enough to ask him, no, and trust him with protecting Ace. Think about that for a second. The Pirate King's final request was to a Marine, and not just any Marine, but the one who had spent years trying to catch him. That's not a rivalry, that's respect on a cosmic level. It's the kind of bond that can only be forged through battle, through near-death clashes, and through shared ideals that neither of them would ever admit out loud. Roger didn't see Garp as an enemy, he saw him as an equal, maybe even the only man who could have walked the same path, if he had just chosen a different direction. But Garp did make a choice, and what's wild is that even though he stayed loyal to the Marines, you never get the feeling that he was truly loyal to the world government. He fought for people, not politics. For justice as he saw it, not absolute justice. And if you think about it, maybe that's what made him truly dangerous. And the next part proves exactly why. In a world where even admirals have to bow before the whims of the Celestial Dragons, Garp was the only one who looked them dead in the eye and didn't flinch. He had no problem punching pirates, monsters, even literal giants. But what made Garp legendary wasn't just his fists, it was that unshakable conviction. He could have risen to the very top of the military, stood toe-to-toe with the Gorosei in terms of influence, and yet he chose to stay grounded. That kind of independence? That's exactly what the Celestial Dragons hate the most, because they can't control it. And the truth is, Garp probably could have overthrown the whole system if he ever really wanted to. That's not an exaggeration, that's a cold, hard possibility. If Garp had teamed up with Dragon earlier in his life, or if he had decided to expose the secrets he learned during the God Valley incident, who knows how history might have changed. Some fans even speculate that Garp knows more than he lets on, and that he's protecting the world in his own way, not through obedience, but through silent resistance. And honestly, that theory doesn't sound too far-fetched, because the more you look at his choices, the more you realize Garp never fought for the system. He fought in spite of it, and the way his story ends might just prove that. Next is the former fleet admiral of the Marines, Sangoku. While Garp carved his name into history by refusing to play by the rules, Sangoku took a very different path, one that was just as legendary but far more complex. Because where Garp represented the wild, untamed justice of a man who followed his heart, Sangoku stood tall as the calculated, strategic, no-nonsense fist of the world government. He didn't just wear the uniform, he embodied it. And during Roger's era, when the world was spinning in chaos and monsters like Rocks, Whitebeard, and Roger were turning the seas into battlegrounds, Sangoku rose through the ranks not by brute force alone, but by becoming the one man who could outthink and outmaneuver even the wildest pirates pirates on the map. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but his presence is unshakable. And when people say he was the Navy's answer to Whitebeard, honestly, they're not wrong. Because this guy wasn't just powerful, he was terrifyingly efficient. But power on its own wouldn't have been enough to put Sangoku in the history books. What truly sets him apart is that, alongside Garp, he is one of only 2 Marines ever confirmed to possess all 3 forms of Haki: observation, armament, and conquerors. And he didn't just have them, he mastered their advanced forms. Let that sink in for a second. In a world where even top-tier pirates sometimes lack Conqueror's Haki, Sangoku had it as a Marine. That alone puts him in a completely different league. And then there's the Devil Fruit, the Hito Hito no Mi, model, Daibutsu, a mythical Zoan that literally turns him into a golden Buddha, one of the rarest and most spiritual powers we've ever seen in the story. The visual impact alone is crazy, but the raw shockwaves he can unleash with that fruit is pure devastation. It's no wonder they call him the Great Buddha. And honestly, when your name carries divine weight, you know you're not just another admiral, you're a symbol. But Sangoku wasn't just a beast on the battlefield, he was also the brains behind the Navy's biggest operations, the man who strategized from the top while still being strong enough to step into the fray when needed. During the peak of the Roger era, he served as one of the admirals alongside Garp, and their tag team was basically the final defense line between total anarchy and what little order the world government could still claim. But unlike Garp, Sangoku never rebelled, never strayed, never hesitated. He climbed the ranks and eventually became the fleet admiral, proving that loyalty to the system could still produce greatness, though some fans argue at the cost of something deeper: freedom. And that contrast between him and Garp only gets more interesting when you realize, if you really want to understand Sangoku's legacy, you've got to look at Marineford. This wasn't just a war, it was the war. Whitebeard, the strongest man in the world, bringing hell to the Navy's doorstep to rescue Ace, all while the world watched. And right there, standing at the highest platform, orchestrating every move like a grandmaster, was Sangoku. He wasn't just fighting Whitebeard, he was fighting chaos itself. And despite all odds, all the casualties, and all the emotional weight that came with watching Ace, Roger's son, face execution, Sangoku kept the machine running. He didn't break. He didn't flinch. He made the call to bring in the warlords. He authorized the final trap. He took full command of one of the bloodiest and most pivotal wars in One Piece history and won. But here's the thing people often overlook. Sangoku hated it. You can see it in his face, in his words, in the quiet weight that clung to him after the war ended. Marineford may have been his victory on paper, but it clearly came at a massive personal cost. Because behind all that discipline, Sangoku wasn't blind. He knew what the execution of Ace represented. He knew the emotional wreckage it would cause, not just for Luffy, but for the world. And in the end, even after winning the war, Sangoku did something totally unexpected. He stepped down. Just like that. He passed the torch to Akainu, a man whose vision of justice was far more extreme, far more violent, and far less balanced. And that decision is still debated to this day. Some fans believe that Sangoku retired not because he was tired, but because he disagreed with where the Navy was heading. And the next chapter of his life gives that theory even more weight. Here's something most One Piece fans either don't know or completely overlook. Zephr, also known as Z, wasn't just some filler movie villain cooked up for the sake of spectacle. He was real. He existed during the peak of Roger's era, and what makes that so wild is that he stood shoulder to shoulder with literal legends: Sangoku, Garp, and the rising tide of monsters that defined the old world. While the anime-only crowd might write him off because of film Z, which tells a story technically outside the canon timeline, Oda has confirmed Zephr's existence as canon. He wasn't made up, he was part of the original generation of admirals. And the fact that the story has barely shown anything about him, that's not a flaw. It's one of the biggest mysteries still lurking behind the curtain. Because what kind of admiral do you have to be to train Kizaru and Akainu, and still get completely erased from the historical record? That's what makes Zephr so fascinating. Unlike Sangoku, who was the face of command, or Garp, who wore rebellion like a badge of honor, Zephr represented a different kind of Marine entirely. He was the one who walked the line between duty and grief, and ultimately paid the price for choosing his heart over the mission. At his peak, Zephr was one of the Navy's most respected admirals, leading operations during the same chaotic era that gave birth to the Pirate King, and yet, outside of the movie and a few scattered references, his battles, his triumphs, even his losses, are nowhere to be found. It's like history tried to forget him. Or maybe the Navy wanted to forget him. After all, a man who once believed in justice so deeply that he trained the future of the Navy, only to later become its greatest threat, that's the kind of story you bury. And what happened next? It changed everything. Zephr's fall from grace wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, tragic, and terrifyingly human. After dedicating his life to the Navy and serving as one of its strongest pillars, he suffered a loss that no soldier can train for. His wife and child were eliminated, and just like that, the unshakable admiral started to fracture. But instead of seeking revenge or spiraling out of control in public view, Zephr did something unexpected. He resigned. Not in rage, not in rebellion, but in a kind of cold, silent grief that's honestly more heartbreaking than any big, flashy breakdown. He walked away from the admiral title, but not from the Navy, because even with his soul shattered, he still believed he could do good. So he took on a new role. He became the Marine instructor. And this is where his legacy gets massive. Zephr didn't just teach new recruits how to hold a sword or follow orders. He trained the next generation of monsters. Akainu and Kizaru, every one of them passed through his hands. And yeah, those three would go on to shape the modern Marine era in radically different ways. Justice through brutality, balance, and apathy. But they all came from his philosophy, his training, his ideals. So So even though Zephyr eventually turned on the Navy, his fingerprint is still etched into its most powerful weapons. That irony isn't lost on anyone. But here's the coldest part. Despite his insane influence, he's almost completely missing from the main storyline. You'll find barely a scrap of information about his past, his battles, or his relationship with the other admirals. No flashbacks, no callbacks. Just a single shadow looming over the foundations of the modern Navy. And when you realize how important he could have been in Roger's era, it makes the silence surrounding him feel intentional. Which leads to the question fans have been asking for years now. Why was Zephyr erased from history? Now this is where things get weird, because out of all the names tied to the Marine legacy, Garp, Sangoku, Zephyr, there's one name that quietly sits at the top of the hierarchy, and yet we know almost nothing about him. That name is Kong. And while most One Piece fans have at least heard of him, the truth is, very few actually understand the weight of his presence. Kong wasn't just another admiral or elite officer, he was the fleet admiral during the time of Gol D. Roger. That means while Garp and Sangoku were out there becoming legends in real time, Kong was already leading the entire Navy from the top. And not just leading it, shaping it. He's not just a veteran, he's the man who commanded the most powerful Marine era in history. And yet somehow he barely even shows up in the story. That silence? It's loud. Because here's the thing, being Fleet Admiral isn't just some ceremonial title. It's not handed out like candy. Every person who's held that position has been, without exception, a monster in combat and a strategist in war. Sangoku is a genius tactician, with all three forms of haki and a mythical Zoan. Akainu may be a walking natural disaster with a justice complex that could burn cities down. So, if Kong was above them, if he trained them, then what kind of monster are we really talking about here? Some fans actually believe that Kong might have been the strongest Marine of all time. Stronger than Garp? Stronger than Sangoku? Maybe even rivaling the top-tier pirates of his era, Rocks, Roger, Whitebeard. It sounds crazy at first, until you remember how rare the Fleet Admiral title is, and how every single person who's ever held it has been nothing short of terrifying. But what happened next only deepens the mystery. After Roger's execution and the dawn of the new pirate era, something interesting happened. Kong stepped down. He didn't get defeated. He didn't retire quietly into obscurity. He elevated. And this is where it gets wild. Because he didn't just pass the torch to Sangoku and go fishing. He became the commander-in-chief of the world government. That's not just a promotion, that's ascension. The commander-in-chief is one of the highest positions in the entire world government system, only below the five elders and Imu themselves. He can override decisions made by the fleet admiral, influence CP0, and potentially even shape the entire political structure of the world. Think about that. A Marine rising so far that he becomes a political force? That's not normal. That's historic. And this is where the speculation goes crazy, because fans are starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the reason we haven't seen Kong fight is because Oda's saving him. There's been a lot of buzz online about the idea that Kong could reappear in the final saga, possibly as a last safeguard for the world government. If the Navy starts to fracture, if the Gorosei fall, and if Imu is exposed, then it makes sense that someone like Kong, someone who's been pulling strings from behind the curtain, might step into the spotlight one final time. And if that happens, we might finally see why the Navy once bowed to his command. We might finally see the power that built the Marines into what they are today. But until that day comes, we're left with a legend hidden in shadow. And that's the part that's driving fans insane. Let's get real. Kong isn't just another blurred silhouette in One Piece. He's the shadow tucked behind the heavy Marines and the omnipresent world government. He was Fleet Admiral during Roger's era, quietly issuing orders while Garp and Sangoku nailed the legend building on the battlefield. That's a massive power position already. But then he steps down and becomes Commander-in-Chief, effectively outranking even the current Fleet Admiral. That's huge, and yet we've seen zilch action from him. But that silence, it's not emptiness, it's hecking loud. One Reddit thread put it best. Kong made a brief appearance in Chapter 594. Was he a one-off character for Chapter 0, or does Oda have grander plans for him in the series? That nails it. Oda's never done one-off legends, he plants seeds. Kong hasn't just faded into the background, he's probably waiting for a moment that matters. Another fan noted, he's the head of Cypher Paul, hinting at his influence and power within the world government. Plus, the fandom wiki confirms he's got authority over the Cypher Paul network, warlords, when they existed, and can revive or call a buster call at will. That's break glass in case of existential threat levels of power. Then there's the fan theory that puts this into next-level context. Some believe Kong trained Garp and Sangoku, the very titans shaping Marine history, maybe even influencing hockey development itself. And that leaves you thinking, whoa, he's not just strong, he's foundational. There's been buzz that he might even rival Akainu, or Sengoku's peak Kong might be Oda's ultimate wildcard. You've been here before. X-Drake appears dormant until Whole Cake. Kaido lays low for years. Kong? Classic Oda, building intrigue quietly until boom. If Luffy's journey truly shakes the foundation of the world, this man has to surface, even if only for a heartbeat. The fandom already expects it. One Redditor said, if the Navy starts to fracture and Imu is exposed, then someone like Kong might step into the spotlight one final time. And honestly, that feels right. Kong is the kind of figure Oda teases for decades, letting you simmer in uncertainty until the moment you go, oh, that's why he was quiet. So here's the real juice. Fans are tired of Oda adding mysteries and leaving them unaddressed, but Kong feels different because he's quietly omnipotent. He's that one card in the deck you never saw coming, and if he does show his hand, you know the world. He's that one card in the deck you never saw coming, and if he does show his hand, You know the world's about to explode. Whether he becomes an ally, an anti-hero, or someone whose power shakes even the Five Elders, Kong's arrival would be pivotal. And if he never shows, that silence becomes a signature move, the kind that echoes through lore and conspiracies. Either way, he's one to watch.